Σεβασμιότατοι, σεβαστοί πατέρες, κυρίες και κύριοι, ξεκινάει η πέμπτη συνεδρία.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with the fifth session with the title Ecclesiology and Nationalism in the Postmodern Era. I would like to thank the Academy of Wole for this honorary invitation to preside over one of the sessions of this especially interesting conference. And it is clear to me that I am very happy that I am once again in this very creative venue. Today, this morning's conference has three speakers. The Associate Professor of the University Ecclesiastical School of Theology, Christos Karakoulis, Father Nicholas Ludovikos, so he's a professor at the Ecclesiastical Academy of Thessaloniki and also a lecturer at Cambridge and the professor at the Theological Seminar at New York, Paul Meyerdorf. We will begin with Mr. Karakoulis. I will say very few things about his work. You all know him. He's very well known both at the Greek and the international audience. He studied at Thessaloniki and he specialized on the New Testament. He was a visiting professor at the universities of Bern and Munich. He's a member of many societies and associations, especially on New Testament studies. He's also a member of publication committees of many journals, and his research interests focus on the epistles of Paul and the Gospel according to St. Paul. He has written many books and articles, both in Greek and in other languages, and he has also co-published books. I will mention his dissertation, which is about the theological significance of miracles. And I think that you can find out the rest for yourself. So I would like to ask him to take the floor and speak about church and nation in the New Testament, the formation of the first Christian communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Eminencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by noting that I will have to speak a little bit more briefly, so I will only focus on the formation of the Pauline communities, although initially, I wanted to speak about all the first Christian communities. I think it will be better to focus on these communities, the Pauline communities. So I will go immediately to start speaking about this and the national Jewish identity. According to Hutchison and Smith, an identity of a group is generally defined by the following characteristics. First of all, a common name denoting the group. Secondly, a common myth of a common origin. Thirdly, memories of a supposed common past. Fourthly, a common culture, including traditions, language, and religion. Fifth, a connection with a homeland. And sixth, feeling of community, of belonging to a community. The Jewish people have all the above characteristics, and they remain different from their other communities in their environment in Galilee, and also in the diaspora, because this is the area which is very much of interest to us, because in the diaspora, the Jewish community is in contact with other communities, and the result of this contact is that some Jewish people become assimilated in their environments, and therefore we have the Gentiles on one hand, those who accept the Jewish dogma and the Jewish traditions, including circumcision and the law of Moses, and also another group that applies the law in a less strict way. In these national environments, the Jewish people are usually citizens of second class, whereas in the Pauline communities, both the Gentiles and the Jewish people are part of the same church, having the same rights. And this is something that has happened for the first time in the ancient world. It was to be expected that many difficulties would crop up, and I will focus on these difficulties when discussing the problem of national identity in the Pauline communities. In their in his letter to Galatians, Paul describes a problem that has cropped up in the Jewish community. There are those who refuse to participate in the community. Peter and Barnabas, who are present, do not participate in this common dinner. So Barnabas is challenging Peter for not participating, because this violates the law, Mosaic law, that normally would ask for Jewish people to participate in the dinner.
The community is divided in two parts. There is no common Lord's Supper. The Gentiles are considered second-class Christians, just as the Jews in the context of the synagogue. In the same letter, we see the problem of the imposition of circumcision and the Mosaic law to the members of the Pauline communities of Galatia. Circumcision and the observance of the law constitute very basic identity markers. I'm referring here So when these identity markers are imposed on the Gentiles, this means that there is a process of Judaization going on. Superior people, which is based on a narrative of exclusive call from God and a special relationship to God, tries to impose itself to an inferior people, to the Gentiles. The intention of the Judaizers is to assimilate the Gentiles and to abolish their identity and to impose the Jewish national identity. Paul is opposed to this perspective. The reasons are theological. If the Gentiles accept the circumcision, then Christ came to the world in vain. Christ himself, of course, lived as a Jew. This fact does not seem to preoccupy Paul, who interprets the death of Christ and not the life of Christ as a fact of liberation of all men from law. But the law is an identity marker, and so by being abolished, also the need for imposing the Jewish identity on Gentiles is abolished. Everybody can maintain his identity because Christ is dead, and salvation is not realized through the law, but through faith to him. In some of Paul's letters, there seems to be a polemic against Paul by Judaizers, And the apostles has some very sharp accusations against them. By trying to impose the Jewish identity to the Gentiles, the Judaizers turned themselves against Paul because in his person they see somebody who incarnates resistance to the Judaization of Gentile Christians. They question his apostolic identity, his authority, and his prestige, the truth of his gospel, and even his sincerity and his impartiality. Paul answers back against these accusations. There is the sense when reading the letters that if Paul did not react actively against these accusations, then along with then his theology would also suffer. The various national groups, when they clash between each other, they have a tendency to create splits in the unity of the supranational community in which they belong, and even schisms. One such schism took place in the example of Antiochia, as witnessed in the letter to Galatians. Another problem seems to arise in the Rome community when the Jews of Rome come back from exile after the death of Claudius, and especially the Jewish Christians seem to face a hostile attitude on the part of their community, which is now made up exclusively by Gentile Christians. In the letter to the Romans, we see the traces of this problem. The fact that Paul tries to demonstrate with very detailed arguments the value of Israel and its temporal priority in the history of salvation compared to the nations, this constitutes an indirect but clear testimony for the fact that the remaining Christians in the Rome community undervalue the Jews, and they seem to face discrimination on the part of their Gentile brothers. As we have already mentioned, for Paul, the problem of ethnic national tensions seems to be a great risk that undermines the foundations of the existence of communities. Depending on the situation, Paul tries to give the relevant answers. In the famine that takes place in Palestine and afflicts the Christian communities, Paul responds by organizing a very large-scale charity in order to support the Jewish Christian communities that he has founded. Paul justifies this operation by using the metaphor of a balance. The Gentiles received the spiritual gifts of the Jews, and now the Jews should pay back the gift. That is the material gifts, and so we will have a balance. Paul, through this charity, tries to show to the Judaizers of Palestine the fact that his communities, although they have not adopted the Jewish identity, they participate in the problem, in the problems of the Jews of Palestine by showing a feeling of brotherhood. These same Judaizers had been criticizing Paul and had been characterizing his gospel as heretic. The material aid gathered by Paul has a very important symbolic dimension. It is a message of love, forgiveness, unity, brotherhood, reconciliation, and especially a call for questioning the narrow limits of Jewish identity and opening up to a different interpretation. Paul, when he's systematically attacked by the Judaizers who tried to question his legitimation as an apostle and the core of his theological teaching, tries in his letters to defend himself with extensive theological arguments, and in many cases by using a polemical rhetoric. Paul mentions the risk of the isolation of his communities from the truth of the gospel, whereas his enemies are based on the axiom that if Paul is not credible, then his teaching is not true. Paul, on the other hand, stresses his apostolic identity, which he has received from Jesus himself. So he saw the resurrected Christ himself, and he was called by himself to become an apostle. And he insists that his gospel is the only truth that can lead to salvation through faith. But why do the Judaizers try constantly to deconstruct the person and the teaching of Paul? Because they move within the narrow boundaries of their Jewish national identity, according to which the teaching and action of Paul are a constant threat. So we see two tendencies clash. The one tendency of the Judaizers, who try to impose their national identity to the Gentile Christians. That is, to transform the Christian into a Jewish community by adding simply the faith to Jesus. On the other hand, the other tendency, which is represented by Paul, is based on the respect of diversity and the liberation of Gentiles by Jewish identity markers. In this context, Paul feels that he has to defend himself and his teaching because he is the founder of the communities whose identity is in question. Repeatedly in his letters, Paul stresses the need that communities should have unity and cohesion, and he's trying to achieve compromises between the opposing tendencies and also to isolate the dissolving elements. In this context, he's trying to achieve a synthesis between the Judeo-Christian religious respect and the new reality of Christ. So in the letter to Romans, he speaks about a part of the community, the so-called strong part, who do not distinguish between foods, and then another part, the weak part, so-called, who distinguish between different foods. So we have a clash between Jewish identity elements and Gentile identity. Jews criticize the Gentiles who do not limit themselves with regard to the days and the foods. But on the other hand, also the Gentiles. So the solution proposed by Paul is mutual tolerance. But finally, a relevant problem appears in Corinth, and again Paul gives similar answers. Paul rejects the claims of the Judaizers in the letters to Galatians and to Philippians, but at the same time he stresses the need for unity and reconciliation between the members of the community. Especially in the letter to Philippians, the rhetoric of unity is very impressive. Every man has to seek for the interest of his neighbor, and you should have a single spirit, a single soul, and you should be humble and demonstrate a spirit of self-sacrifice. Through the respect of national diversity and through the pursuing unity, Paul aims to solve the problem of the clashes between different communities in the same community. Repeatedly in his letters, Paul presents himself as a model for the faithful to imitate, just as Christ is a model for himself. Paul experiences the death of his older self. Christians, according to his theology, are new creations. The old man who is subjected to sin and death has been abolished through baptism and through participation in the death of Christ. So, although we would expect Paul to have completely negated his Jewish identity and his Jewish past, this is not the case. Paul stresses the fact that the Jewish identity markers are still valid for him. He's a Pharisee from the Benjamin tribe. He's the son of Jews. He has been circumcised. He's familiar with the law, and he calls the Jews his brothers. And these markers are indelible. On the other hand, all these marks are so-called rubbish. He does not believe them anymore. They become secondary components of his identity, which receives new components, new identity markers, and markers of expression. In the letter to Philippians, Paul describes this change in an impressive way. The knowledge of Jesus Christ leads him to redefine his Jewish identity. He does not seek justice through the law, but justice through faith in Jesus Christ. Throughout his life, he imitates through his suffering the passion and the death of Jesus Christ in order to conclude in the resurrection from the dead. So on the basis of that, he calls the members of his community to imitate him and to relativize their national identity as a determining mark of their life, and to move from the faith to perfection and salvation in Christ. Finally, Paul does not limit himself to the problems described above. He reduces the value of Jewish identity, and he abolishes some of its basic characteristics so to integrate it into a new identity, the identity of a man in Christ, which has supranational characteristics. I will mention some of the basic characteristics of this new identity that Paul attempts to imbue to the members of his community. First of all, Paul preaches liberation from the law. Law has no salutary value. Its only function is pedagogical. This theological evaluation of the law, which was a basic identity markers of the Jews, is a serious blow to the established identity of the Christians. So even though he accepts that Jewish Christians still seem to apply the law, although strong consciousness for Paul is full freedom from legal rules. Even the Christian Jews who still observe the law should not have full conviction about this law. Paul is very adamant on this point. No member of the community should believe that he can be saved through the law. Those who believe that negate Christ because they accept that there is a different way of salvation apart from the faith in Christ. Paul understands that there is a deep rupture between Judaism and Christianity. The rhetoric of opposition that he uses in his letters testifies this idea. Old, new, letter, spirit, sin, grace, wrath, justice, new Adam, old Adam, etc. This rhetoric aims at instructing the readers of the letters to reorient their identity and redefine it. Some of the older components of identity are not valid anymore, but this radical change leads to the creation of a new identity. This new identity, as with all identities, unites and separates at the same time, connects and limits. The new identity of the Christian connects and unifies the members of the church communities independently of their national identity. This is apparent in the terminology used by Paul in order to express the new reality in Christ. So Paul uses the language of kinship. All Christians, Jews and Gentiles are brothers in Christ. He uses also the language of human physiology, the description of the human body. All Christians are members of the same body, which is the body of Christ. No member is inferior or superior. All members are necessary for its harmonic operation. This is true with the members of the body of the Church. And finally, he uses the language of the New Testament in order to bridge the differences between Jews and Gentiles, so that Jews feel that they continue their tradition, even though they have to interpret it, of course, and Gentiles would feel that they participate in a primordial narrative which includes themselves and their history. So all the above delimit the members of the identity from the outside, because those outside do not belong to the body of Christ. They are not faithful, and they are not children of Abraham and Isaac spiritually. So the new identity of the Christian is not constructed in a vacuum, but in pre-existing foundations, in representations from the everyday life of the people of the time, both the Jews and the Gentiles. The metaphor of the body, of course, was not invented by Paul. It pre-exists in the philosophy of his time. The concept of brotherhood of man also exists in the Greco-Roman world and in Judaism, and the concept of a common origin as a factor of a new collective identity, of course, is not a new concept too. So there is a continuity with pre-existing representations, but there is also discontinuity because these pre-existing representations are radically reinterpreted in such a way so that for the first time in antiquity, they are connected in a supranational, unified identity that links Jews and Gentiles. So Paul does not aim to abolish national diversity, and this, for him, is not a problem for the unity of his communities. His vision is a common community where there is no value priority of Jews with respect to Gentiles. Unity does not abolish diversity, but overcomes diversity, just as men and women just as gender is not abolished, so nationality is not abolished. The Jews remain Jews and the Gentiles remain Gentiles, but their difference is overcome. And the same is true about slaves and free men. Paul does not want to abolish the differences between Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles are not considered as Jews in the Pauline communities. And Israel is not identified with the whole church in Paul's letters. In order to refer to the church as a whole, Paul prefers a different terminology. For instance, the terminology of family. The main characteristic of the new identity is faith in Christ. This relativizes the characteristics that divide the members of the community. Paul stresses constantly the life in Christ as the reality experienced by every Christian, whether Jewish or Greek. This derives from the grace of Christ and the baptism as the participation of the faithful in the salvation. The fact that Jesus Christ is the true God who became man and died for the salvation of all men without exception is the basis on which Paul builds the new Christian identity. If Jesus Christ was a mere man, then his life and his death could not inspire the creation of a new identity or the absolute faith in his own person as the basic identity market of the new Christian community. The faithful in the divine nature of Jesus Christ allows Paul to relativize the Jewish identity, and in this respect, the achievement of Paul to inspire a new unifying identity to communities of Jews and Christians is historically unique for his time. The presupposition for this Pauline achievement is his faith in the proximity of presence. Paul does not want to create radical changes in social structures. On the contrary, he uses the pre-existing social and hierarchical structures and the customs, even the customs that could even potentially create serious intracommunal problems, such as speaking in tongues in the Corinth community. Paul shapes the new supranational Christian identity by using pre-existing elements, since he sees the end coming. Much later, the Byzantine state tends to identify itself with the kingdom of God. So the eschatological orientation of the early church fades away, and the church now lives within a realized eschatology. This quasi-realized eschatology had as a consequence the abolition and the absorption of the national identity. The Roman state tried to absorb these identities with often destructive results. Also, Western Christianity, maybe even more, tried to absorb and assimilate and abolish the various identities of the ethnicities, and this also contributed to the Reformation. So history teaches us that it's very difficult but also very fruitful to do what Paul did, that is to respect the different national identities and to lead them to the synthesis of a new supranational identity that presupposes and cultivates diversity without considering it as a threat. In contrast, it is very easy and also very destructive to impose one's own national identity to all the others. The modern and contemporary Orthodox Church tried to solve the problem of the coexistence of members with different national identities in the diaspora by allowing or even encouraging the creation of separate communities based on ethnicity. And in this way, it managed to avoid problems and clashes, but it also created different altars and in practice an implicit schism. Chair, Your Eminence, for the Church to avoid the conflicts between different identities of its members is difficult, but through this tension, maybe to reach synthesis, this is the difficult path, but this is the only path that leads to the establishment of the true Christian identity, which is able to overcome national identity without abolishing, and where the identity markers are not language, customs or rituals, but Christ himself and the love between brothers. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Karakoulis. He was within the time limit. It was a very dynamic presentation and very coherent. And I'm sure that we will refer to it in the discussion. I will just note one word, the word synthesis, that Mr. Karakoulis used. This is a very important word, and it is also the title of a new electronic journal of the Department of Theology of Thessaloniki. Now we will move to the next speaker, Father Nikolas Ludovicos, professor at the University Ecclesiastical Academy of Thessaloniki. He's very well known in theology at an international level. Despite his, apart from his scientific work in the academy, he also teaches as a lecturer in Cambridge. He has given seminars there, and he has also given lectures to various universities and research centers. He has written many books. I've read them all. I should mention his dissertation about apophatic theology, which has been published twice, if I'm not mistaken, in English. And his last book is about Gregory Palamas and Thomas Aquinas. Father Nikolaos, you have the floor for 30 minutes. Your Eminence, dear colleagues and friends, I have written my presentation in English, and it was difficult for me to translate it in Greek, so necessarily you will listen to me in English, and maybe in the discussion we can speak in Greek again.
Nationalism has undoubtedly become one of the most dangerous temptations for the Christian Church over the last centuries. Concerning specifically the Orthodox Church, as it is widely known, nationalism represents a sort of absolute ecclesiological sin, which tends to compromise ecclesial unity and disturbs any effort for articulating a concise theological account of the ontological meaning of the Church as communion for the modern world. On the one hand, it is imperative to note that modern nationalism can even become a sort of substitute for religion, a false secular church, as the School of Frankfurt, and especially Max Horkheimer, has so successfully shown. On the other hand, it is also true that this identification of the Church with various nations never did have any serious theological bedrock in the Orthodox Church. Ethnotheology has been usually a sort of kerygmatic discourse, psychologically or ideologically useful in certain periods of time of a national history, but never a systematic theological discourse. Of course, this happened due to the lack of theology, but this is another question. The above official position indicates that a meaningful distinction has to be made between nation and its idolization, the latter of which is a better definition of nationalism, precisely in the context of systematic theology. First of all, the idolization of a nation must, of course, be considered as a post-lapsarian reality. The nation in itself is not against the will of God. The dispersal of human beings on earth, as described by the book of Genesis, absolutely follows God's commandment, and thus the shaping of different nations and tribes can be considered as a sort of blessing rather than a curse. The theological question raised here is precisely how this blessing can be fulfilled. We shall see that the baptized nation is conceived as a Christological reality in both East and West, as a nation in the Church, something that changes any merely natural conception of it. Whenever this perspective is shadowed, as we shall see, the presuppositions of an idolatrous conception of nation are already there. The wake of modern nationalism as a cult of nation represents the defeat of Christian political theology. But further questions arise here. If the above is true, is it possible for theology to take part in modern discussions concerning the reality of nation? The political dimension, however, by being also national, is not only that of the state, but also that of the community. In this way, can theology perhaps help modern political theory to become, in a very specific way, anthropocentric? Can we make any ecclesiological suggestions for a possible reorientation of modern national consensus? Let us now try to spell out answers for the above questions. The fundamental underlying dialectic, or if you like, according to George Florovsky, the antinomy within the newborn Christian Roman Empire was that of the empire and desert. That was the final form of the primordial dialectic between Rome, or Constantinople, as a second Rome, as eternal city, and the Church, as the coming kingdom of God. In the Respublica Christiana, the emperor is charismated by the Patriarch, and the parallelism between the two authorities in a perspective of collaboration, but also occasionally of conflict, thus started. The final outcome was the gradual secularization of the Church, which became the Church of the Empire, and the eschatological reaction of monasticism, which discovered a real eschatological society in the desert, removed from the empire. In a way, this dialectic was perpetuated in the so-called Byzantine Empire, though through the ages, under the form of a tension inspired by both the Eucharistic and the monastic experiences between a protological understanding of history and an eschatological understanding of it. As Runciman has shown, this tension is always present in the public life of Eastern Roman Empire, and it is finally eschatology that usually prevails. This protological understanding was the way of conceiving of history as the field of the glorious preponderance of the empire, regardless of the moral standards of the time, while the eschatological understanding was that of the ontological interpretation of eschatology, which maintains real history while it constantly opens it to its last uncreated meaning. History thus becomes the field of a deep encounter with the incarnate Logos as an extension of the consequences of the incarnation, space and time. What is important is this, in this understanding of eschatology, is that not only the Church, but also public life in general becomes the material of an eschatological dialogue between man and God, a dialogue of ontological character as it refers to the very essence of beings that will be fulfilled in the end times, but starting from now, as beings are not just given, but also talked about between man and God concerning their mode of existence. The created participants in this dialogue are not only individuals, but also nations, as we shall see below. Thus, we now see baptized nations in a perspective of an ecclesial theology of charismata. We have the possibility of an ecclesialization of nations in the context of a polyethnic, or better, hyperethnic empire. A classical text which expresses this charismatic understanding of nationality in an ecclesial Christological perspective is the following text by Gregory of Nazianzen. It is highly important to note that the one who talks here is a Greek speaking of the Egyptians, considering them as his nation in the eschatological, charismatic, dialogical, and ultimately Christological perspective described above. Citation, St. Gregory Nazianzen. I embrace you, the most excellent and most friendly to Christ and most warm in piety people of Egypt. It is impossible to say something more than that, and I am saying only a few things in words and much more in movements of my heart. My people, since you are the same with me, because of the same veneration of the Trinity and the same Holy Fathers, my people, I communicate with you because of your so many martyrs, and I forget your bad spiritual attitude of the past because of your new sanctity. My people, although I am so little before you, my people, because this is precisely the grace of the Spirit, that means to make equal those who believe in the same things. My people, because our souls are bound together in the Spirit. My people, in whom God indwells in order to offer you gifts. People whom the Lord chose for himself, more than any other people, of those whom he invited. My people, whom the hands of God have painted. I have chosen this little text as a characteristic example of the Greek patristic position concerning nation. Dozens of similar texts that can be found in the footnotes of this paper can be found throughout the patristic literature, showing the new ecclesial understanding of nation, which can be changed into a sanctified member of a universal body of Christ, bearing his name and expressing him in its own special way. We thus have a sort of eschatological or ecclesiological understanding of nationality, in a sense of a dialogical reciprocity between nations and God in Christ, transcending their ethnophyletic differences, or better, changing them into spiritual charismata. Any sort of nationalistic antagonism is also transformed into mutual admiration and loving devotion. It is clear that any expected dedication to Christian Hellenism is, in this perspective, absolutely meaningless. On the contrary, the charisma of the other is more precious to me than my charismata, since it is only through the offering of his charisma to me that I obtain Catholicity. One can find similar texts in the West during the same period of time. Let us read the characteristic one coming from the pen of Augustine. During her residence on earth, the heavenly city appeals to all nations in order to find there her own citizens. She doesn't care at all for anything that is different concerning dispositions, laws, or various institutions through which peace is obtained or maintained. She does not transgress or annihilate anything. On the contrary, she complies with them. Although these institutions are different and depending on the differences of nations, they tend toward one goal alone, i.e. peace on earth. It suffices for them not to put obstacles to religion, which teaches to worship the only supreme and true God. During her residence on earth, citation continues, the heavenly city uses the earthly peace concerning what is necessary to the mortal human nature. She protects and favors the unification of human wills, since this unification allows piety and religion to be maintained and refers the earthly peace to the heavenly one. The heavenly one. One can find there the true peace, which is so true that it can be called the only peace for the logical creature. Such peace is the great unification, most orderly and most inner, through which we enjoy firstly God himself and secondly each other in God. End of citation. What we see here is a similar perspective of absolutely accepting the expected natural differences of nations in view of their ecclesiastical transformation in charismatic members of Christ, in a dialogical reciprocity which leads to the heavenly peace that characterizes the heavenly city. It is true that Augustine opposes the heavenly city to the terrestrial one in a more acute way as compared to the Greek fathers. As we shall see later on, the reason for that is perhaps, on the one hand, the ancient Greek tradition of political theory, which sees the polis in a more anthropocentric and less institutional way than the Roman tradition would allow, and on the other hand, the particularities of Greek Christian theology concerning a more positive account at times of the theology of creation and history. In any case, the supposition becomes a great theological problem in Thomas Aquinas. John Milbank summarizes the problem as follows. Citation, but what is much more alien in Aquinas comparing with Augustine is the idea of a permanent political sphere concerned with positive goals of finite well-being and clearly distinguished as a natural institution from the Church as a supernatural one. It is true that Aquinas, like Augustine, does not recognize any real justice that is not informed by charity, and that he has, in consequence, moved not very far down the road which allows a sphere of secular autonomy. Nevertheless, he has moved a little, and he has moved too far. by beginning to see social, economic, and administrative life as essentially natural and part of a political sphere separate from the Church, Aquinas opens the way to understanding the Church as an organization specializing in what goes on inside men's souls. His affirmation, for example, possibly inconsistent with his own affirmations of the consequences of charity, that the new law of the gospel adds no new external precepts, seems to tend dangerously to this direction. A separation between what is spiritual and of citation. A separation between what is spiritual and what is secular is thus established. A separation culminating in modern philosophy. Nation can be thought of as a separate natural historicity in a self-sufficient autonomy. Most importantly, nation, as it always becomes finally a state, it becomes also finally subjugated to the one central goal of history, extremely general and abstract, which give a meaning to the institutional existence of modern state and the will to power that underlies it. And because this paper is too long, we have to pass some pages. Just in the pages that follow, I analyze this abstract understanding of the state using text of Hegel and Leibniz and at Popper in order to show how the nation through the state it becomes a preconceived reality, an abstract application of a preconceived unity of the spirit before the ages. So we have the beginning, the seeds of the totalitarian state. For Popper, the totalitarianism is somehow inherent in the creation of the new state. What we lose in this direction, I return to the text, is the anthropocentric meaning of sociality. In a book of mine, I have called this anthropocentric meaning an existential or micro-historical society or state, comparing it with an institutional or macro-historical society or state, referring them respectively to the Greek-Byzantine political theory and to the Latin Nordic Western theory of state, in a perspective of a possible combination of them. There is no room, of course, in this paper to repeat my arguments. What I only want to stress here is that it is only through a certain interpretation of ecclesiology in terms of political theory that we can see nations and communities in a perspective of a personal, micro-historical, existential communion, which in its turn can transform the macro-historical political sphere into an anthropocentric cosmos system. It is exactly this separation between the ecclesial and the secular that prevented a great part of Western thought from understanding the Byzantine state as an ecumenical cosmopolis, as it were, and not only a merely authoritarian empire. The difference between such a cosmopolis and an empire is, in terms of this paper, precisely the possibility of having or not nations or communities, at least theoretically, in a perspective of an ecclesial charismatic coexistence, in synergy within a state, which thus is not completely submitted to a general, abstract goal of history, but it is also partially open to many different existential goals, which the personal or national charismata can provide. I am not saying here that this idea was achieved in Byzantine history, but that there existed a considerable amount of examples pointing to that direction. The empire did not dedicate itself merely to the historical, political will to power, but also understood itself as a depository of spiritual goods that transcend historical efficacy, thus tending at times through its intellectuals to a more anthropocentric conception of polis or as koinonia. In the next pages, which we shall omit also, I deal as an example with the reading of the work Prince, Machiavelli's Prince, comparing with the Prince of Photius the Great, where I'm trying to see what I mean with this perspective of a post-anthropocentric transformation of state through a spiritual understanding of nation. We don't have time for that. And of course, what we want to say is, what we need to say is that we have the well-known medieval transformation of the state. We now have, after Joachim de Flora, this understanding of a state as a metaphysic reality, not only a natural one, but also a metaphysic reality, in the sense that we have a kind of autonomous understanding of state. The state can have a goal of its own in history. And in a way, we have this emergence then of nationalism within this sort of state, and the reaction to that, the reaction that created the only orthodox theological comment upon that, which is that of Alexis Komyakov. Alexis Komyakov created a response. We, of course, reject Komyakov today, but for his time was a response to this possibility of understanding nation in a perspective of a suffocating state, and giving it also giving to human community a more spiritual meaning. Of course, as I said, this is absolutely unacceptable today. Now, in order to go to the last part of my presentation, I want to say a few things. I'm in the middle now. About modern political understanding of nation, in order to show how this patristic tradition that has been described, highlighted, can be applied, can come into terms with this new understanding of nation. It is, for me, it's unavoidable to do this, otherwise we just do history, and I'm not a historian. Let us start with Gerner. I have to say a few words for Gerner, Anderson, Hobsbawm, and then Hroch and Anthony Smith. Just a few words. There are pages here. If this is published sometime, you can find the references. As it is widely known to the experts, nation, for Gerner, nation and nationalism are exclusively modern phenomena, and they are products of the industrial, of course, revolution. And this is very important to know, that it is impossible to have nationalism without a state. The nationalism is a kind of harmonization between state and nation, and this is the new thing that this modern understanding of state brings through Gerner. The state appeared in history with the help of nation, and that means that it comes in a certain state of human history, not the the agricultural state, not the pre-agricultural state, not the agricultural, but in the industrial stage. And in this phase, we need a kind of homogenized civilization in strong dependence on a powerful center of authority, and we need a kind of typified communication between the members of this state in the form of a common language that can be taught and transmitted, and this is nationalism. The nation is given birth through nationalism as a result of a highly communicative culture, and wants somehow to help nation, to help the state to fulfill its historical goal. For Benedict Anderson, a nation is an imagined community. Imagined here means that no one of its members have ever met all the other members, which thinks of itself as a political entity with concrete boundaries and absolute dominion within those boundaries. And we have a kind of substitution here. We have the religious community, the dynastic regime, and then comes, after the fall of all, after the collapse of this, of the traditional religions or communities, the conviction that society must be organized around some sense of high authority, and the collapse of the theocratic conception of time, as he describes this successive periods, in order to finally to have nation through the form and by the means of the printed capitalism, as he calls it. papers, newspapers, and novels printed in the language of the city. And Hobsbawm is very close to Gellner. The difference is that he begins from his analysis from above, not from above but from below. That means that he searches for a texture of national consciousness in order to, this means the language, the fact, the race, the religion, in order to articulate the understanding, his understanding of nation. But always here the nationalism comes. It is the state, the idea of a nationalism that creates a nation, and not the opposite. The situation changes with Anthony Smith, and this has to be well noted. With Anthony Smith, we have the opposite understanding. Although Smith is a disciple of Gellner, he criticizes his teacher. He makes things absolutely different. And now we have a new understanding, this a multidimensional identity as is the national identity. And that means that it's a human nation is a human population with a certain name, sharing a historical territory, possessing common myths and historical memories, public culture, common economic, common rights, common obligations. And this multi-dimensional identity is impossible to be imposed in an artificial way upon a certain population, as modernists claim. That means nation is something that precedes the state. This is the new this is the new perspective brought by Anthony Smith. A state is created by a nation. This is the opposite understanding of nation here. And
5 minutes, 2 from the moderator. 7.
Okay. It is now we can say in that way that we have accepted nation in a way in modern political theory, but not without the criticism made first by the School of Frankfurt, and especially Max Horkheimer, and then the Lacanian critique of modern political theory, which is very important. Just 2 words for Horkheimer, just to say that for him, nation can become a substitute for religion. And I idolized a new idol, and he proposes a correction of that through religion, which is a longing for the absolute and no more a worshiping community, but in this way, we have love as a possible correction of the idolized nationality. Of course, this tends to be an utopia. Without a worshipping communion, it is very difficult to understand what we mean by saying that love can correct things. And we have also the Lacanian, which is very, very important. We don't have time. I like this very much, this Lacanian understanding of nation, where the identity construction depends on an ability of a discourse which has to explain the lack of a past fullness and completeness, find a scapegoat in order to understand what happened in that past, and then create a new discourse of completion, in order to replace the imagined lost enjoyment. And that means that the bedrock of national identity lies in the unique way in which a group finds enjoyment, the lost enjoyment that was lost. This is why the national identity is so, we can say, corrupted from the beginning. I mean, it's a psychological reality that cannot be transformed without a help from outside. And this is the worship community. Now I will dedicate my last minutes in order to read these 2 last pages of conclusions. As we have seen, Orthodox theology facing the problem of the idolization of nation oscillates between an ecstatic relativization or even rejection of it and an aim of transforming it within the Eucharistic community, depending on the way of its conceiving of eschatology, either as ecstatic or ethical or as ontological. On the other hand, it is true that this transformation, well known as a theological position in the first Christian millennium, can perhaps happen only not simply through the Christian ideas, but only within a real worshipping community. Our survey of modern accounts of nations showed that, although nation has finally been accepted by modern thinkers after its metamodern annihilation, it is impossible for modern political theory to cure its distortions. This is a meaningful weakness, since it means that only through a dialogical or eschatological ecclesial theology of charismata is this recovery possible. Thus, a living Eucharistic community can transform nations and nationalisms without abolishing them. And in a way, the political life of the state can also be affected and become more anthropocentric. This eschatological anthropocentrism is not completely unknown in the West, since, as Gianni Vattimo said, political theory in Western thought always bears the marks of early medieval Christianity in an assimilated form. The question is, for how long will this be possible if Christianity is definitely changed into an anemic longing for the absolute, as Horkheimer would like it to be? Without vivid and conscious worshipping communities, how can it be possible for a nation to be illuminated by the liberating and transforming aura of the Spirit of communion in Christ and offer existential space to the other? And if this space is not offered in the name of Christ, but only in the name of the state, then who can check the final reason for this offering, the final goal of history, which is thus served? Who can effectively transcend either ethnophilatism or ethno-nihilism? And furthermore, who can even slightly be suspicious of the claimed neutrality of the modern Western state without participating in a Eucharistic community which gives him a sound eschatological sense of history? No one except perhaps some modernists is absolutely sure that the modern state or family of state does not have a not easily fathomable goal of history by the citizens, those being innocent and clear from any suspicion of serving other interests and not those of his citizens. No. The above questions cannot easily be answered without what Orthodox theology has to offer is perhaps, along with this ontological or dialogical eschatological theology of charismata, this micro-historical existential understanding of state, where the possibility of assisting nations to a step-by-step transformed, to be step-by-step transformed, is ecclesiologically encouraged, although not any more easily achieved in our epoch. In this case, the political dimension can, as we said, become anthropocentric. In my view, some fundamental characteristics of this political anthropocentrism, of theological or eschatological inspiration, are the following, and I finish with that. First, human beings are not just given. Man is becoming what he is. Man bears God's image upon him as the freedom of an eternal self-creation in personal dialogue with God and the others, and we shall fully know what he is only in the eschata. Politically speaking, this means that man cannot be objectified. He cannot be a part of any impersonal corporation or a means for any hidden design or purpose. Man always exceeds political manhood. Nation is the natural historical content of this personal self-creation in dialogue. If it is transformed into a reality of dialogical reciprocity, instead of being a means for excluding the others from this active dialogue. Second, human, direct, or existential, in contrast with the institutional relationships of any sort, have to be given an absolute account. The merely institutional communion between the modern Western we-less eyes, according to the fine expression coined by Norbert Elias, who are at the same time usually wordless eyes, according to Fergus Kerr's expression, has led the West to what Elias called homo clausus, men and women trapped in their individuality and trying to escape it through various idolizations of the public sphere, and nation is the first candidate. Nowadays, even this tendency to idolization tends to be replaced by a general feeling of disappointment and perhaps depression, the depression of the definitely lost other. Theology can re-establish the hope that the other really exists and help the public sphere, and nation in particular, to find its dialogical function towards an anthropocentric transformation of the institutional society represented by the state. And third and final, Any apparent or hidden political theory or discourse concerning the final goal of history has to be replaced by multiple suggestions concerning the multiple meaning of history. Ontological eschatology, according to St. Maximus the Confessor, is deeply connected with his teaching of the multiple incarnations of the Word, as he calls them. Christ, although he is unique, he becomes specific and special for each baptized believer, according to each one's charisma. The same thing happens with nations. Thus, there also exist national charismata, i.e. national gifts, natural gifts, which can become spiritual charismata if they are developed in truth and justice according to God's loving will. These charismata provide history with multiple meanings, not necessarily contradicting, but enriching and supporting each other in a perichoretic way. Nations can be parts of a multi-meaningful history. This understanding of history makes it a field where political anthropocentrism can flourish in light of a dialogical, perichoretic, or eschatological ontology of nations of theological inspiration. Thank you very much for your patience.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον πατέρα Νικόλαο Λουδοβίκο.
Thank you very much, Father Nicholas Ludovicos, who you have tried to use the time that was given to you to give us a very detailed presentation. And indeed, he tried to begin a dialogue between the patristic theology and the question of the conference. He used all the weapons given by sociology, by political science, by theology. And if I'm not mistaken, he has proposed finally political humanism inspired by eschatological prerogatives and defined by Christian theology. I would like to thank Father Nikolaos, and we will move to the last speaker of this panel, Mr. Paul Meindorf, professor at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary in New York. He will speak about ethnophilitism, autocephaly, and national churches, a theological approach and ecclesiological implications. He was born in Paris in 1950. He earned his doctorate degree from the University of Notre Dame. He's currently Alexander Schmerman Professor of Liturgical Theology at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary. He's the editor of the seminary's Quarterly, and he has participated in many international conferences and churches, consultations, and commissions. He has published extensively in journals, books. I'm sure we've all read some of them. You have the floor to speak.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for the timeliness of this topic. Ecclesial developments over the last 2 centuries have led to a complex and problematic situation for world orthodoxy. First came the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the resulting development of independent nation-states in Eastern Europe, followed soon after by the creation of autocephalous national Orthodox churches in those states during the 19th century. The 20th century brought 2 world wars, one crisis after another in the Middle East, the spread and then the collapse of communism, with the resulting church persecutions, as well as the migrations of many Orthodox to the West, to Western Europe, to North and South America, and to Australia. Upheavals that led to anomalous church structures in those areas, with parallel jurisdictions and competing ecclesiological visions. Now we in the 21st century are left to untangle this mess and to attempt to restore proper canonical order consistent with the Orthodox ecclesiological tradition. As recent decades have shown, this is not an easy task. Nationalism has only grown in both the political and religious spheres. We today are witnessing the difficulties in maintaining unity within the European Union, as well as conflicts and power struggles among the various national churches. And in the West, whether in Western Europe, Australia, or the Americas, canonical order has totally broken down with the existence of multiple jurisdictions and multiple bishops in the same place. Worse yet are the attempts to justify this situation with claims that the situation poses no problem because we are all in communion, or, more recently, that the national churches have the responsibility to minister to their diasporas outside their canonical boundaries. In this sense, we have moved backward in the last 50 years. In the 1960s, everyone acknowledged that the diaspora situation was scandalous. Today, the tendency has been rather to rationalize and justify the status quo. So my first section addresses ethnophilatism and nationalism. The relationship between church and state is hardly a new problem, though it has been accentuated in recent centuries with the creation of national churches. On the one hand, primitive Christianity existed within the Roman Empire, and Christians were taught to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, Matthew 22, and to pray for the ruling authorities, even long before these were Christian. On the other hand, these Christians clearly understood that while they were in the world, they were not of the world. Thus, St. Paul, in addressing the various churches, uses expressions such as, to the church of God which is at Corinth, ti ecclesia tu Theou, tiousi, and Corintho. He did not use the terms such as the Corinthian church or the church of Corinth. These Christians had a strong sense that their home was not in this world, because here we have no lasting city. Indeed, the very word that we use today for the local Eucharistic community, the parish, parochia, implies precisely the idea of a temporary sojourning. And this term was originally used not simply for the local parish, but for any community of Christians organized as a geographical unit, including a diocese or an ecclesiastical province. In the world, but not of the world. This is the ambiguity that has challenged Christians throughout history. And the answers to this challenge have varied throughout history as well. Following the Peace of Constantine and the eventual establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church grew closer to the state. Bishops achieved a high rank in the empire and in society, and the organization of the Church followed imperial structures. Constantine and his successors launched a massive program of building churches, and imperial court ceremonial influenced the development of what we know today as cathedral worship, or the Byzantine Rite. The rapid spread of monasticism in the 4th century was at least in part motivated by a sense that the leadership of the Church was compromised by this close connection between church and state, and for many centuries since, the monks served as a check against church authorities that were often controlled or dominated by civil authorities. Of course, monks were themselves not above involving themselves in political affairs of both church and state. For example, during the Hesychast period in the 14th and 15th centuries, when a number of Hesychast monks, including, for example, Philotheos Kokkinos, assumed the patriarchal throne in Constantinople and struggled to enhance the power and prestige of the imperial city and the church. This history is well known and need not be repeated here. A major characteristic of this entire period, however, was its non-nationalistic character. The Roman, as well as the Byzantine Empire, was multi-ethnic and multinational, as indeed was the Russian Empire in later centuries. In this context, the Church was similarly not organized according to nationality. Any idea of organizing church life according to ethnic criteria was rejected, as exemplified, for example, by the famous Canon 28 of Chalcedon, whose intent was precisely to include the barbarians, in other words, non-Greek speakers, within the local structures in the territories of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, areas that were under Constantinopolitan jurisdiction. The principle that there is neither Jew nor Greek was taken seriously in the canonical tradition of the Church, as was the territorial principle. In recent centuries, the situation has changed dramatically. The old imperial structures have collapsed, including the Byzantine, then the Ottoman, and finally the Russian, twice. As a result, new nations arose in the old Orthodox world, in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Repeated wars and other cataclysms in these regions also led to large migrations of people, not just within these traditionally Orthodox areas, but also beyond, to Western Europe, the Americas, and Australia. Obviously, each area has its own history, its own particular characteristics, but there are common trends that pose serious challenges to Orthodox ecclesiology. The first consequence of the collapse of empires was the redrawing of the map of Europe and the creation of numerous nation-states, frequently on the basis of ethnicity. Following upon the creation of these states came the creation of autocephalous Orthodox churches in each state. In one sense, this was certainly in conformity with the Orthodox canonical tradition, since from ancient times, autocephalous churches were established in accordance with political structures. The difference here was the ethnic factor, which risked becoming more significant than the territorial factor. We can trace the roots of this ethnic factor back into the period of the Ottoman Empire, when the patriarchs of Constantinople functioned as head of the Orthodox Christian population, the millet, which resulted as well in their subordination of the ancient churches of Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, and the development of a Greek hegemony in these struggling churches. Despite the condemnation of ethnophilatism in 1872, ethnic identity became an important factor, alongside the territorial principle, in the self-identity of these newly established churches. Thus, it has become customary today to refer to Orthodox churches with an ethnic tag, the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek, Romanian, Bulgarian, Polish, etc. Lost is the original Pauline understanding of the church which dwells in Greece or in Russia. The situation grew more complicated and more problematic with the emigration of many Orthodox Christians from their traditional homelands into areas without organized Orthodox dioceses. The size and ethnic composition of these migrations varied from place to place, and I have chosen to focus my attention on North America, because it is the situation with which I am most familiar and because it raises the significant issues in the most poignant way. Orthodoxy in North America began with the Russian mission in Alaska that began in 1794 and was in fact part of the missionary outreach of the Church of Russia to Siberia and the Far East that began in the 17th century and continued through the 19th. At that time, Alaska was a Russian territory, and the mission was directed at the many native tribes in this northern region. In 1840, Alaska became a missionary diocese, and Father John Veniaminov, the future Saint Innocent and Metropolitan of Moscow, was ordained as its first bishop. Following the sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867, the missionary diocese moved its headquarters first to San Francisco in 1870 and then in 1905 to New York, where St. Tikhon, the future Patriarch of Moscow, was bishop from 1898 to 1907. During the 19th century came the first waves of immigration and the establishment of the first Orthodox parishes in the lower 48, the continental United States. Some of these new parishes received support from the missionary diocese, while others were independent of episcopal authority and were controlled by lay boards of trustees. During the latter part of the 19th century, with increasing immigration and the mass conversion of several hundred thousand former Eastern Catholics, the missionary diocese expanded rapidly. Thus, in 1905, Archbishop Tikhon submitted a proposal to the Holy Synod in Moscow to reorganize the missionary diocese into an independent, multi-ethnic American diocese with auxiliary dioceses for each ethnic group. He mentioned specifically the Arabs, the Serbs, and the Greeks. He already expressed his hope that the mission in America would evolve into a local territorial autocephalous church. In 1904, Tikhon consecrated Raphael Hawawini, an Arab educated in Russia who was recently canonized by the Church of Antioch and the OCA, as an auxiliary bishop with responsibility for the Arab Christian community. In 1907, Tikhon convened the first All-American Council in Mayfield, Pennsylvania, assembling hundreds of clergy and lay delegates. Throughout this period, it is evident that the Church of Russia understood itself to be following the well-established Orthodox principle that the creation of new churches was the responsibility of the church that initiated missionary activity in a particular area. We should note as well that no other church at this time challenged this in any way. We should be careful, however, not to paint an idealized picture of the situation, as there were parishes functioning with no episcopal oversight, and there was some resistance to what was perceived as Russian control, particularly among communities of Greek background. Though the ecclesial situation was not entirely clear in the early 20th century, it was thrown into total chaos following the 1917 Communist Revolution in Russia. Support from Russia disappeared, and soon the church in America was racked by divisions, both ethnic and political. As a result, during the 1920s, the various ethnic jurisdictions were created by the Old World churches, with several jurisdictions again subsequently splitting again, typically for political reasons. In particular, several of the Slavic jurisdictions, as well as the Antiochian, each underwent further splits as a result of political disputes, ecclesiological disagreements, and external pressures. There were those who wanted to remain loyal to the mother churches in communist countries, others who rejected communist domination, so there were multiple splits. The result, in any case, was the scandalous situation of multiple jurisdictions, divisions along ethnic and political lines, and multiple bishops in the same city. And Orthodox Christians in America came to refer to themselves not simply as Orthodox Christian, but as Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, in other words, always with an ethnic designator. This has led to a caricature of Orthodoxy in America, exemplified in the popular film My Big Fat Greek Wedding, in which the fiancé of a Greek woman, after being baptized, is told, "Now you are a Greek." Unfortunately, this perception appears not simply in the broader American culture, but comes from within the heart of the Orthodox community. I vividly remember a priest and professor from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Theological School commenting after hearing his audience at St. Vladimir's Seminary sing O Heavenly King, the hymn of Pentecost, "Oh, you Russians sing so well." Ironically, there was not a single Russian in the room. Most of the audience consisted of American converts to Orthodoxy, with a few cradle Orthodox of various jurisdictions or various ethnic backgrounds thrown in. One jurisdiction, the direct descendant of the old Russian mission, known before 1970 as the Metropolia, refused to submit to Soviet control, and as a result was in 1933 excommunicated and declared schismatic by the communist-controlled Church of Russia. It was this group, later joined by several other ethnic jurisdictions, Romanian, Albanian, and Bulgarian, that was eventually to become the Orthodox Church in America. This jurisdiction, alone in this constellation of ethnic churches, understood itself as multi-ethnic, and despite its at times desperate material situation, maintained Archbishop Tikhon's vision of a united territorial church in North America. The Metropolia opened 2 seminaries in 1938, translated service books into English, participated diligently in inter-Orthodox and ecumenical activities. St. Vladimir's Seminary, its leading theological school, gained a worldwide reputation as a center of Orthodox theological thought, chiefly in the person of 3 of its deans, Father George Florovsky, Father Alexander Schmemann, and Father John Meyendorff. Most significantly, this jurisdiction did not see itself as being in diaspora, but understood itself as being placed providentially in America to witness to the truth of Orthodoxy in a new and missionary context. It is this last fact which I believe highlights precisely the theological problem with any sort of ethnophilatism, nationalism, or jurisdictional pluralism. While it is clear that orthodoxy is an incarnational religion, and therefore one that is able to insert itself and transform any culture, it is equally clear that orthodoxy cannot be bound by any particular nationality or culture. This issue is as old as the Church itself, and was faced by Peter and Paul, by the apologists in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and in every period since. The challenges of each age have differed, and so too the Church's responses. Whatever challenges the Church faces, however, the principles remain the same. In the Church, there can be no division between Jew and Greek, no division based on nationality, race, or gender. The warning that St. Paul addressed to the Corinthians who are split into factions, "It is not the Lord's Supper that you eat," remains applicable to us today. Similarly, the paradoxical tension between being in the world but not of the world must never be lost. A clear danger when the Church becomes too closely allied with the state or with any single political faction within the state. In fact, the Church is at times most effective when it stands against the authorities, as when the Russian missionaries in Alaska defended the natives from abuse and exploitation by the very Russian-American trading company that brought the missionaries to Alaska. St. Herman of Alaska, for example, had to leave Kodiak for Spruce Island precisely to avoid persecution and possible death at the hands of the representatives of the Russian company. Ultimately, then, ethnophilatism and the divisions in church life that it creates hinder the Church's missionary efforts, both inside traditionally Orthodox lands and in the West. Our increasingly secularized world needs the answers that Orthodoxy can provide, but our excessive identification of the Church with particular cultures or ideologies, be they Greek, Russian, or any other, as well as our many divisions in the West, greatly reduce Orthodox credibility in a world that has become ever more secular and cynical about the Church. Autocephaly, Part 2. No topic has been more controversial within world orthodoxy in recent years than autocephaly, and particularly how it is attained. It is precisely this issue that has slowed the convening of a pan-Orthodox council and may derail it altogether. The controversy includes different interpretations of Canon 28 of Chalcedon, as well as claims by Constantinople that it alone, in the absence of an ecumenical council, can grant autocephaly. The details of this debate are well known, and in my opinion avoid and indeed mask some more fundamental issues. The first concerns the very nature of autocephaly. For modern debates on autocephaly, in the words of Father John Meindorf, quote, attribute an exaggerated importance to the concept of autocephaly, and thus inadvertently surrender to the modern exaltation of that concept by ecclesiastical nationalists, unquote. I would like here to summarize some of his conclusions which seem worthy of our consideration at this symposium. And the text I'll be quoting are from a report that he prepared at the request of the Constantinople to study papers that Constantinople had prepared in preparation for the future council. He criticizes the ecumenical patriarchate for considering autocephaly as a major institution, therefore, quote, to be dealt with by ecumenical councils only and only temporarily by the ecumenical patriarchate, unquote. And here I have an extended quotation. In fact, local de facto independent primacies, which we today call autocephalies, represented the norm of church organization before the establishment of the major patriarchates. In later centuries, they were often established only to be restructured or suppressed later. It seems to me quite inevitable, therefore, that in order to meet the requirements of our present complicated and rapidly changing world, there must be much in forms and procedures with the absolute condition that the ecclesiological principles defined above must be respected. In other words, territoriality, one bishop in one city, and accepted as the norm toward which all temporary arrangements must tend. End of quote. The ecclesiological principles, which he enumerates at the beginning of his response, represent full agreement with the position of Constantinople, one bishop presiding over one church in each place. But then he goes on to critique the current situation. Quote, "The most tragic aspect of contemporary orthodoxy is that it has de facto ceased to act as the one church and instead has adopted a system where local and predominantly national or ethnic churches live a totally independent life, establishing communities everywhere and preserving only intercommunion with each other, as if sacramental communion did not imply unity in ecclesial structures and administration. This philotism de facto is precisely what was so fortunately condemned by the Council of Constantinople in 1872." End quote. In short, autocephaly has gradually changed from its original function, in which it was a practical mechanism by which the church in a particular region could form its own synod, elect its own primate, and settle its local affairs, while at the same time assuring the unity of local churches throughout the world. During the modern era, the model for autocephaly has become the nation-state, with its focus on promoting self-interest and absolute independence. And this is a model that leaves little room for any form of primacy at the universal level. So it is that today we see national churches not just competing for power and territory, but establishing ethnic churches across the whole world to minister to their diasporas. In some cases, this is even enshrined in contemporary church statutes. I cite but two examples, the first from the Church of Cyprus. Quote, "The membership of the Orthodox Church of Cyprus includes 1. All Christian Orthodox Cypriots who entered into the womb of their church through baptism and who reside permanently in Cyprus, as well as 2. All those who are of Cypriot origin and who today live abroad." Or Russia. The jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church extends to 1. Persons of Orthodox faith residing in the USSR, or the former Soviet Union, residing on the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as 2. Persons implied of Russian origin residing abroad and voluntarily accepting its jurisdiction. Again, these are in the official statutes of those churches. In this way, nationalism and ethnic identity are placed above the territorial principle and local unity is destroyed. The result is a kind of colonialism, which in fact creates local divisions and prevents bishops in America, for example, from effectively resolving local problems, as all issues need to be referred to synods in the home churches. It remains to be seen whether the recently established episcopal assemblies in America and elsewhere will boldly take a leadership role in the creation of normal canonical ecclesial structures, or whether they will abdicate their responsibilities and wait for others to decide their fate. As already noted above, not only has the idea of autocephaly been overemphasized, but so also the process by which it is granted. Father Meindorf repeatedly points to Theodore Balsamon, an authoritative interpreter of the canons, who states that the privilege of establishing autocephalies belongs to ecumenical councils, to the emperor, and to individual patriarchates. And he considers it quite normal, for example, that it is for the Patriarch of Antioch to affirm the autocephaly of the Church of Georgia, known as Iberia in the ancient text, because it was under its jurisdiction. In the case of Russia, which was connected with the Diocese of Thrace, it fell within the jurisdiction of Constantinople, and thus it received its autocephaly from Constantinople. We should note as well that in most cases, autocephaly in each place was a de facto reality before any official proclamation or recognition. The Church of Russia, for example, became ecclesiastically independent, in other words, began selecting its own primate, some 150 years before this was recognized by the Patriarchate of Constantinople in 1589, a recognition that in fact was granted only under duress, and then affirmed later by councils in Constantinople in 1590 and 1593. In the last 2 centuries, as new national churches were created in Central and Eastern Europe, as the Ottoman Empire retreated, recognition typically came decades after the fact. On the basis of these facts, one can conclude that autocephaly typically begins as a reality on the ground and as a result of local initiative, with recognition often only grudging and typically after the fact. The process then is rather messy, with no clear guidelines provided in the canons, and particularly in the case of the so-called diaspora, the Orthodox churches in Western Europe, America, and Australia, the canonical tradition does not provide clear answers. Is autocephaly the answer? Is some form of autonomy? Certainly the present situation, with multiple ethnic jurisdictions, with multiple bishops in the same city, is intolerable and violates proper church order. The key issue, however, is not autocephaly, but unity. No canons require autocephaly, but Orthodox tradition and the canons do require unity in each place. And this unity can be achieved only when the bishops in these areas themselves bring it about through local conciliar action, unrestrained by external control. Do they have the desire for this unity? And equally important, are the mother churches ready and willing to allow this territorial unity to happen? That remains to be seen. And now a few words of conclusion. Absolutely central is the need to restore a proper ecclesiological vision, a vision that has been severely hampered by the historical developments in recent centuries. Yes, historical circumstances have created what can be considered as an anomalous situation. It was pastoral need that led to the creation of parallel ethnic jurisdictions in the West. The tragedy lies not so much in these historical realities, but in their acceptance as normal. How often we hear the refrain that though divided we share the same faith and are all in communion. Similarly, the problem lies not so much in the existence of autocephalous churches coterminous with national boundaries, but in the often overly close relation between church and state, in the identity of church with ethnicity, and especially in a new understanding of autocephaly as absolute independence with no accountability to sister churches, and sometimes even jurisdiction extending beyond canonical boundaries to one's ethnic group. How are these challenges, both practical but also essentially theological, to be addressed? One desirable step, which touches peripherally on the topic of the present conference, but which also raises profound theological issues, is a rediscovery of the proper function of primacy, as bearing the responsibility for maintaining unity not simply at the local, but also at the international level. Permit me to conclude with an extensive citation from Father John Meindorf, again from his same 1984 response to the Ecumenical Patriarchate's position paper on questions of autocephaly and diaspora. Quote, "The Orthodox Church always recognized the first bishop, whose ministry is to lead, to coordinate, and to gather around himself the local churches of the world. Following the schism between East and West, that ministry belongs to the Bishop of Constantinople. It is very unfortunate indeed that the various historical developments over the last 2 centuries have led national ethnic Orthodox churches to act as if this universal leadership did not exist. Nevertheless, they all recognize Constantinople's privileges formally, although very often they fail to acknowledge or understand the real content of such privilege. In my opinion, the future witness of orthodoxy in the world depends on a revival of ecclesiological consciousness, which would necessarily involve new awareness of the role of the first bishop. It is essential, therefore, that this role be defined in terms which would be ecclesiologically uncontroversial and pastorally realistic. It seems to me," again, Father John, "that to define the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate as possessing the formal, exclusive right to grant autocephaly or autonomy before a still problematic ecumenical council meets to confirm them, and the formal right of jurisdiction everywhere outside the established autocephalous churches, is unrealistic and therefore harmful to the eventual revival of ecclesiological consciousness. As formal rights, these privileges are today clearly denied not only by the Slavic and Romanian churches, but also practically by the Patriarchate of Alexandria at the time in which this response was composed, and certainly Antioch. Actually, the ecumenical patriarchate itself has been rather inconsistent in asserting such rights. See the action of Patriarch Joachim III entrusting Greek communities in America to the Church of Greece, or the action of Patriarch Athenagoras dissolving his Russian exarchate in Western Europe and calling on its members to return to the Patriarchate of Moscow. Much more practical and more unquestionably canonical would be for the Patriarchate to initiate a sustained, consistent, and charitable series of initiatives aiming at establishing a normal, canonical, territorial order in Western Europe, in Australia, and indeed in America. Whether the ultimate result will be new autocephalous churches or churches under the jurisdiction of the ecumenical patriarchate is ecclesiologically indifferent. It is unity, not jurisdiction, which is and should be the only real goal. Episcopal committees for coordination and collaboration could be a useful tool, but only if their ultimate goal is clear and if they are not used in fact, as it was the case with SCOBA in America, to perpetuate an uncanonical status quo. Some issues of our beloved orthodoxy wait for centuries for a solution. I do not think that the issues debated in the documents can wait as long. End of quote. These words, written over a quarter century ago, still ring true today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Meindorf. Because I think you have given us the conclusion of an entire chapter of this conference that began with our previous speakers, Mr. Karakolis, Father Ludovicos, and Mr. Meindorf. And thank you very much for reminding us of the words of Father John Meindorf. Let me say that I am very much agree with the fact that this current situation is tragic. We are seeking unity in church for many years now. But I think it is important for all of us to recognize that the current situation is tragic. As it was done by all the previous speakers, Father Nikolaos proposed a Christological solution, a Christological interpretation. And finally, Mr. Meindorf has given us the perspective and the experience, the realistic experience, the everyday reality that he lives in his area in the Americas. We have here with us colleagues from Australia, that have to deal with the problem of multiple jurisdictions. We are a little bit late, but we still have 30 minutes, and we can still some time from the coffee break for discussion. 45 minutes, let's say. We can begin the list of speakers. Your Eminence, you have the floor. I apologize for taking the floor first, and I would like to contribute to the discussion, and especially what Mr. Meindorf said about autocephaly. Let me give you some information about what is happening regarding the organization of a pan-Orthodox council. Perhaps it would be best for the chair of the pre-council committees to speak, but let me speak in my capacity as someone who has participated in these committees, and let me give you some indication about where we are and where we're heading to. And regarding the bishop councils, it is a good thing that at least we have the bylaws of these committees. But we are nevertheless very much conscious to the fact that this is not a canonical solution. And we need to go towards the canonical solution of either autocephaly or some other solution that they themselves will select and agree upon. Regarding the autocephaly, it has been agreed that essentially the Ecumenical Patriarchate has given the right to grant autocephaly to an pan-Orthodox Ecumenical Council. So first of all, the Mother Church will have to agree, and then an Ecumenical Council will have to grant autocephaly. Unfortunately, there is no agreement to sign autocephaly, because up until now we have the signature of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. However, the proposal is for the other patriarchates to co-sign. So we have disagreed on that, on how many signatures will be needed to decide whether there will be a decision or a co-decision by all the other patriarchates. I see. So this is very much related to what Father Meyendorff was saying about the role of primacy in Orthodoxy. What does the primacy of the Ecumenical Patriarch mean? And of course that also is related with the dialogue between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church, which has reached a dead end, essentially because it has become an inter-Orthodox dialogue. We need to speak. We don't manage to agree between us, Orthodox churches, and essentially we are the ones who have the problem. We need to agree between us first before we speak to the Roman Catholics. And furthermore, another problem is the fact that we have selected 10 subjects, 8 out of which have already been finalized but will need to be updated. Another one is the autocephaly, and finally we have the diptychs. That is the order of churches. And I'm sorry to say that being a bishop of the Orthodox Church, but we have reached also a dead end regarding the diptychs. There are some churches who are demanding to get their position they are entitled to after decisions by ecumenical councils. Some other churches saying that they should have that there should be a different order. And right now you know that there are 2 different diptychs for Greek-speaking churches and another one for Slavic-speaking churches. I don't know how I could ever explain that to my congregation. It is a tragic reality, though. And why is that? Because perhaps when we attend the Pan-Orthodox Council, we're not only there as representatives of our own church, but unfortunately we're also representing our national identity as Greeks, Cypriots, Czechs, Serbian, Polish, or whatever. This is unfortunately the truth, and this is why we need to pray and to work hard to reach universality, which is something we experience through communion. We experience when we have the liturgy all together, but in practical terms, unfortunately, national elements enter and we don't find a solution. And I really can't see the way out, but I can't see how the Church will be able to provide witness to the world today without resolving these issues. Because the West is seeking a way to salvation. Which, of course, will mean that they will need to accept Orthodoxy as a whole and not only salvation. But when we say that, immediately the problem arises. Which Orthodoxy? Greek Orthodoxy, Serbian Orthodoxy, or... And this is what's tragic about this situation. This is one of the reasons we wanted this conference to happen. I very much welcome everything that was said by the speakers about what we could do as Orthodox clergy and based on our canonical tradition. But unfortunately, we are unable to witness orthodoxy right now to the modern world in practical terms. And thank you for your time. Thank you, Your Eminence. Let me propose that that we gather all the questions together and have the responses by the speakers at the end. I would also like to congratulate the organizers, because all three speakers gave an interesting perspective. But I would like to speak about the first presentation by Professor Karakolis. 99% of what you said was very much interesting and correct, but 1% I would like to speak about the academic theology. I don't see why you're not using the terms used by the Church. The Church uses the term charity and philanthropy. You said activity, operation, which is a little bit secular. I propose to use the term charity and philanthropy because this will lead us to Paul's teachings instead of a more secular approach, as was said yesterday as well. And leads also to a form of solidarity. I believe we should use the term charity, not activity or anything else. For example, yesterday we had a similar problem by using the term symphony, symphonia, instead of synalilia. I believe that what happened in the Pauline communities should be our model for Orthodoxy today. I believe that the framework of the Bible will lead us in resolving our problems, like the third speaker said. But I believe we should not think about only the first patristic tradition that did not have to deal with the problems that arise after the appearance of the Islam and other barbarians. And this is especially true in the region of Africa. We should also refer to the patristic tradition when nation-states were created in the modern years. For example, the late Meyendorff, isn't he also expressing patristic theology when, for example, we had violence of Ottomans against the peoples of the Balkans? One of the first decisions of the Constantinople Council was an appeal to every bishop to create a local school. So we saw that the church did not become secular, but it accepted the laws about the organization of the state, etc. The chair asks for the questions to be a little bit briefer. So the church accepted the new calendar, etc. But I would have very much liked to have seen in Father Ludovico's talk to have heard something about the position of the church when the new nation, the nation states were formed. What did the patristic theology say at that point? And for the third speaker, one question. You said that we need strong initiatives to build unity, and we also need the goodwill of the mother churches. So here is my... Άρα, η ερώτησή μου... Άρα, επομένως, η ερώτηση μου προς τον τρίτο μιλητή. Γιατί οι τοπικές εκκλησίες μπορεί να μην επιθυμούν να δημιουργηθεί μια αυτοκέφαλη εκκλησία στην Αμερική? Αυτό για να βοηθήσουν τους πιστούς ή πιθανώς για οικονομικούς λόγους? Your Eminence from the Mitriada, you're very right on your remarks about the dialogue we're having with the Roman Catholics. But I believe what makes Orthodoxy great is the fact that we have no problems of theological creed. We're very much in agreement in all these issues. And we need to stress the fact that the patriarchs have just started to meet. And finally, today we have common positions on the environment, on the religious education, on social issues, on bioethics. The church is based on the creed. If there are administrative problems, we will resolve them in time and with time. Father Manolis Klapsis. The presentations were all very interesting. From my point of view, I'm very much interested of the public witness of the Church. And fortunately, the position of St. Paul provide us with the opportunity to accept diversity in the Church, and that helps us avoid any form of totalitarianism. However, today our societies are multicultural. There are many religions. How can we use the biblical tradition to analyze today's multiculturalism and diversity? And I believe this is very much even more important if we see history as a history of conflicts. There are always many different conflicting interests. And us, as theologists, we're not only expressing our theology, but we're at the same time expressing our proper interests, our proper identity. Therefore, the words of theologists are not an expression, a true expression of orthodoxy. It is rather the expression of orthodoxy as we understand it in a particular time and place. So our worshipping of the Church as such, might that, and worshipping of ecclesiology, maybe is this limiting us and inhibiting us from addressing the public as a whole and more openly? So we need to transcend. We need to find a transcendental response to what the historical events. So coming to Mr. Meindorf's presentation, he talked about autocephaly, which indeed has been a problem in the life of the Church in America, but I'm even more worried about the Orthodox witness in America. Because we see theological views and movements who are isolating orthodoxy. We see an influence of the environment which is affecting negatively the Orthodox morals. Fortunately, this is being preserved in the liturgical tradition, but we need to stress the eschatological aspect of the Church. Therefore, the question of the Church's witness inside today's world is what I believe should be the topic of discussion, and taking into account very seriously that nationality and other forces of society are not something which is outside the Church. It is also something that is inside the Church as well, and sometimes change through theological approaches.
Θα ήθελα θερμά να ευχαριστήσω και τους τρεις εισηγητές. Ακούσαμε
I'd like to thank all three speakers. All three of them were very important and interesting. I would like to speak more about the presentations by Mr. Meindorf and Mr. Karakolis. I would very much like to thank Mr. Meindorf for his clarity in the analysis he made, for exposing this tragic situation in the diaspora and the dead ends we are facing, ecclesiologically, theologically, etc. I agree with everything he said. But since this is an open discussion and we are here to have an open dialogue, I would like to pose the following question. Quite a simple one, but a central one for furthering this conference. So my question is, what is your practical proposal? What are you proposing in practice? And since you have experienced the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America, since you have seen that, I would like you to make a judgment or even a little bit of self-criticism. Is this autocephalous church, what kind of autocephalous church is that? Because perhaps it is only, its members are only a small minority of all the Orthodox people in America. So we need to learn from our mistakes in the creation of this autocephalous church, perhaps. And of course, these mistakes were also made by the Greeks, by the Antiochians, not only by the Americans. Now, Mr. Karakolis, you've also been very helpful in explaining us the current situation. But, you know, regardless of specific faith, other Orthodox faiths, creeds have the same problem. But when we discuss nationalism, we often say we're against nationalism, but we are in favor of a healthy patriotism. Well, no one admits being a nationalist. They all say that they are good patriots. But as Mr. Karakolis has showed, from the experience of the first Christian communities, and I believe this is something that His Eminence Kállistos Ware also said, each one of us today has a multiple identity, an identity which is composed of various other identities that need to be sorted, need to be put in order. I may be Greek, I may be from Cappadocia, I may be supporting a specific football group from Thessaloniki, but I will need to decide which of my identities is more important. Are we all sure that our Orthodox identity comes first? Because right in this room we have people from Serbia, from Antiochia, we have Romania, etc. Some of these identities sometimes are not compatible for each other. For example, between Serbia and Albania, or in the past between Greece and Bulgaria. When our churches identify themselves with the history or the destiny of a nation, when we have churches that bless arms and weapons and bless the wars, That is, when we are not able and we're not willing to transcend our national identity in favor of our Orthodox identity, in that case there will be no progress. In that sense, I would say that it is time for Russianism, Greekism, all these isms to die. Not to diminish or for these national identities to disappear, but rather to find a common identity. Mr. Fokas.
I'd like to thank all speakers for your informative, insightful talks. My question is also for Professor Meyendorff. I want to ask whether, in your view, it's possible or worthwhile to try to divide responsibility for the parallel jurisdictions between, on the one hand, ecclesiastical leadership, and on the other, the lay communities, in the extent to which they themselves seek out an ethnic church which represents a particular language and which helps them maintain their own ethnic identity. For me, that was very much my experience of the Orthodox Church where I grew up in the U.S., and it's different from many sociological interpretations of how immigrant churches operate. But in my experience, I think that can be a very powerful aspect, and I wonder how you would... It links for me to Pandeli's his last comment about, are we able to and willing to try to overcome our ethnic distinctions?
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, κύριε Φωκά. Παρακαλώ.
We have 4 or 5 minutes so that we can have a discussion or responses for 10 minutes. Question. What I've been wondering is all these days is why, the why question. Why is there a need for the members of church to do what they do, to link their Orthodox identity with their national identity? One reason might have been a historical reason. In the past, in order for the church to survive, for example, when Muhammad entered Constantinople, or the fear of forbidding religion, etc., the reply that we have found was linking the church to a specific national identity. That was one possible reason. A second possible reason might be a more psychological one, the fact that we are seeking a self-identity, we are seeking to define our own identity, and when in doing that, we're linking all our specific characteristics. In doing so, for example, we say, I'm Greek Orthodox, I'm Albanian Muslim, and I wonder if we have such a psychological compulsion to link the different identities we have, I wonder if it will ever be possible to separate them. And a more practical question about the diptychs. Isn't there an objective criterion based on which we could set the order? For example, when each church was founded, the chairman says, well, I'm afraid it's not that simple. You will get the response on that. Mr. Stamatopoulos. I would also like to thank all the 3 speakers for their excellent presentations. Let me say to Mr. Karakolis 2 comments. The first one is methodological, and then the other one is of substance. And in your presentation, my friend Christos, I was wondering if there is an anachronism of what ethnic meant. At the time, Gentile meant paganist. So the relationship between a Jew and a Gentile is not the same thing as the relationship between 2 different nations. It is more a religious division. For example, Jews may be non-Israelite, And I think it's also very much possible that there are internal divisions between the Gentiles. So we could research the fact whether there were such divisions within the Gentiles. We could find it from non-biblical sources. So that was my methodological comment. My second comment now, I was able to link some other aspects of Paul's teachings that had impressed me when I used to read his epistles. I was wondering, though, how Paul understood the concept of Christian ecumenicity. Is it a community without national or other divisions? This is one thing. But another thing might be how you understand the relationship between this community with authority. For example, in the 13th chapter of the Epistle to Romans, if you read it, being a Democrat would definitely give us the impression that Paul was totalitarian. But I believe that these two aspects are interlinked, because Paul knows that when creating a community from the grassroots, they will need to find later on a political authority. And the political authority will need to be different and separated in order to reach Christian unity. Therefore, we're not subjecting the community to the Roman authority. We're rather providing a relationship with this authority. Now, Father Nikolaos referred to Anthony Smith rather than modern philosophers. I would like to propose Anderson, not so much for his interpretation of imaginary communities, rather because he talks about this specific problem, the totalitarian regimes and how these are created over the years. But by selecting Anthony Smith and national identity markers, I wouldn't like to see us returning to Herder's view about national characteristics and national specificity. Because this is a delicate issue about orthodoxy. There was a criticism of the Frankfurt School that renovated the discourse of the time. But when we speak about particularity, specificity, that may open the door to romantic nationalism of the 18th and 19th century. And instead of avoiding nationalism, we may be opening a back door to nationalism by doing that. I would also like to thank the speakers. And my question is for Mr. Meindorf. Historically, the institution of the Patriarch, how much is it linked to nationalism? Because etymologically the word means the father of each nation. And is there a difference or a distinction between the Patriarch and the concept you refer to of the first bishop? And for Father Nikolaos, could you elaborate a little bit on the theological background of ecclesiological nationalism? And referring to the theological interpretation of the role the Archbishop plays in the communion and his relationship to his congregation. So in general, the role of So the question is there a theological background on the role of the Archbishop? And a final question to listen to the answers as well. My question is about the presentation given by Mr. Meyendorff. I'm sure we will not have the time to answer it, but still I believe it's of central importance for the conference. I know that the late Meyendorff, Smerman, sorry, the late Smerman, was speaking about the confessionalism in the period before Constantine. Are we ready to question this model, which Florovsky said was irregular and antinomy, but at the same time is what is at the beginning, at the roots, which led to ethnophilitism later? I also see historians speaking about that. Perhaps it may also be the reason behind the schism, the separations in the 4th and 5th century. So, what was behind the theological argument might have also been questioning of the authority of the empire. So when the church came closer to the empire, this created a situation in which led to separation, which led to the collapse of the church's unity. So the creation of autocephalous churches, national churches, etc., just followed naturally. But the real reason, or the central question was to what extent the fact that the church became closer to the state at that time led to the other developments. The last question. My name is George Borovilos, and my question is for Mr. Karakolis and for Father Nicholas Ludovicos. We are having a theoretical aspect, but in the 16th century, Makakis had a practical application of such a community, a community in which communion was at the center, and the reborn Christian was a citizen of that community. I would like you to critically review this experiment. Each speaker has 3 minutes to reply to all these questions.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. The first question regarding primacy. Yes, primacy is a critical issue, I think, in contemporary Orthodoxy. But I think it's also a critical issue on the Roman Catholic side as well. As you all know, Vatican I was itself a kind of response to exactly the kind of questions we're dealing with here. It was precisely the issue of separation of church and state, kind of opposition to nationalism that led to the formulations of Vatican I, which have since been interpreted and have their own trajectory, obviously in a Western context. So I would say that we both have issues with primacy, and the dialogue with the Roman Catholics is actually an excellent opportunity for both of us to revisit and rethink how the Church might be structured, especially if we were to move toward unity. The question about the willingness of the patriarchates to solve the diaspora problem, that's a critical issue because obviously for the ecumenical patriarchate, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in North America is their largest church, and if they were to lose that, it would leave them, in a sense, more isolated. And then the same thing with, as we heard yesterday from Assad Katan, the Patriarchate of Antioch has probably its largest group also in North America. And that, I think, goes to, it will take a great deal of, in fact, a brave act of faith on the part of the patriarchates to, in fact, allow their jurisdictions in the West freedom to determine their own fate. But I think going, again, what Pantelis asked, what is my proposal? I think precisely, first of all, there needs to be in the West the creation of local, whether autonomous or autocephalous churches, with a clear canonical structure, a local synod electing its own primate, and so on. However, in terms of a practical suggestion, there is nothing to prevent a bishop of the Greek Archdiocese to sit on the local synod of an Orthodox church in North America, while at the same time being also on the synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople or of Antioch. In other words, creating a local church will not necessarily mean that the mother churches will lose support from their diaspora communities. And so it seems to me that something like that should well be part of the picture. Now, just regarding the OCA, just a brief historical introduction. The Metropolia, the old Russian mission, was in fact excommunicated, declared schismatic by the Russian Orthodox Church. And so from the 1920s until 1960, it remained totally isolated from its mother church. In the 60s, it approached the Church of Constantinople to try to resolve this canonical conundrum and was refused. They refused even to meet with them. They were told by Constantinople, your problem was with the Russians, go to the Russians. So, we were stuck. It was in the 1960s when the Russian Orthodox Church joined the ecumenical movement and attended the World Council Assembly in India, in New Delhi, that the conversations with the Russian Orthodox Church began. Just parenthetically here, it's also through the ecumenical movement in the 40s and afterwards that the autocephalous Orthodox churches started to speak together, because until that point they existed in total isolation, and very often it's precisely through the ecumenical movement that we're able to get together as Orthodox, as well as between the Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox as well. In fact, those conversations began also in that context. So in any case, when the conversations began with the Russian Church, that was precisely Father Schmemann and Father Meindorf who were instrumental in that discussion. The Tomos of, we were surprised actually that the Russian Church was willing to give us autocephaly. We wanted simply to gain some form of autonomy and kind of recognition of our canonical status, which was rejected by the Russian Church. But the Tomos of autocephaly that was granted recognizes, in fact, its provisional nature. Obviously, it did not unite all the Orthodox together, and so, there is some anomaly in that fact. And in fact, directs the Orthodox Church in America to work with all the other Orthodox to create unity. And so we understand our autocephaly to be provisional, and we are willing to give it up in order to join a canonical, united orthodoxy in North America. And we're very hopeful that the Episcopal Assembly, which has recently come into being, in fact takes a leading role in precisely that process. We're not going to give it up until then, because, as some have suggested, because in fact it's the only trump card, and it's also an expression of a vision of a united territorial orthodoxy in North America, which is what we have always stood for. But again, in order to join a greater unit, a greater whole, a greater united church, we will give it up tomorrow if that's what and we understand that that's what it will mean at some point. I'm sorry, on the terminology of patriarch. Again, that terminology is not absolute. Different heads of churches, different primates, they've had different terms. In fact, the Patriarch of Alexandria, his first title was Pope. We do have a Pope in the East. And if you look at the liturgical title of the Patriarch of Alexandria, he's not only Pope and Patriarch, but also 13th Apostle and Judge of the Universe. A title that's actually directed against Constantinople, by the way, in the debates that took place in the conflicts back in those centuries. So, those terms are all relatives, and I would not make kind of absolute theological principles out of terminology, whether somebody's an archbishop, a metropolitan, a patriarch, or a pope. All these terms are kind of very much historically conditioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, it is easy to lay out the problems, but it is very difficult to make proposals. I give the floor to Father Nicholas. Thank you, Mr. Stamatopoulos, for the very fruitful misunderstanding of my presentation. I said exactly the opposite. I said that I reject Smith, although everybody accepts him. His teacher, Gellner himself, considers that he is the next step. So I criticize Smith on the basis of the Frankfurt School, and especially based on the Lacanian political theory. And I'm saying that the nation can be idolized, according to Horkheimer, and the nation and the process of the construction of national identity has certain pathological elements. That's why I invoke theological eschatology. Otherwise, we are at a dead end, we are at an impasse with modern theories of nationalism. And I want to stress the following. It is important what kind of eschatology we use. There are two possibilities. One is the transcendental use of eschatology. So we abdicate the nation in the church. Smith and Lacan help us here to understand that this is not an easy thing. So there is the transcendent use of eschatology, which is very popular by the nationalists, but also the ethno-nihilists. So they supposedly transcend the nation and they move to the eschaton. But real eschatology, if we understand it in ontological terms, that means to work with being in the course of history. It is not an abolition of history. It is not an overcoming of history. It is not moving outside time. We do not get rid of the nation. So we work with these things. You have to work with what you are and what you have now, and not just get rid of it. Now I come to the question of Father, who mentioned about the bishop as an eschatological transcendence of divisions. Yes, if we use the rise eschatology, if the bishop thinks that he is substituting the national consciousness with an ecclesiastical consciousness, then he is wrong. He has to work a lot on these issues. Otherwise, there would be an unconscious nationalism at work. That is, nationalism will return as a collective neurosis. We would think that we have gotten rid of it, but it will return through the Freudian mechanisms back to haunt us. So we have to be careful with the eschatology that we use. Do we use an ideal, a moral eschatology, or an ontological eschatology? And I suspect that in this room there is a lot of transcendental eschatology. This is a utopia, of course. We cannot overcome the nation. So question is also, the nation is also a question of unconscious in the sense of Freud and Jung. So we cannot easily overcome nationalism in a romantic way. We cannot get rid of the nation. That's why we have to apply the crucifix of Christ step by step and work hard on that. And something about Mr. Borovilos. My difference with Makrakis, my big disagreement with him, is that I don't believe that there is this reborn man in Christ. It is a utopian, and that's why I'm not a theocrat. But I believe that there are people whose intentions are such who can work in a direction that can make politics more human. That's why theology can become a source of inspiration, but we are not speaking about theocracies here or Christian democracies. I cannot speak about these things. I consider them naive, but I can be inspired as a faithful so as to return to this form of eschatology that is not transcendental but ontological and historical, and it works with these historical obstacles and impediments that exist. Thank you, Father Nikolaos. You were very brief. I'm very glad with the fact that you said that eschatology is not a way out. This is problematic, of course, and certainly eschatology is not related with a bodiless, a fleshless internationalism. Mr. Karakoulis. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the comments and questions. I will try to be brief, and if I don't cover everything, we can continue the discussion during the break. With regard to His Eminence, thank you very much for what you said. I said the operation of logia, of charity, not in the sense that logia, which is the term used by Paul, was a whole operation. That is, it lasted for a long time. There was correspondence by Paul and his partners and so on and so forth. So this required a special organization, and my teacher, Mr. Vasiliadis, has analyzed remarkably this. Now, with regard to Father Emmanuel Klapsi, thank you very much for your comments. I don't have to add anything. If we asked Paul himself, St. Paul, what you asked, then he would say that the unity of Christians and the Christian ethos is the light of the world. You have to become the light of the world, he says in the letter to the Philippians. Maybe that is the message that we can convey to our own communities, despite our differences and despite the different national consciousness that each of us represent. And with regard to Mr. Karalatsidis, very brief comment, I think that the models of the martyr and the hero are very different, and we tend to confuse them today in the church. But we have to decide, because these two things are incompatible. We cannot canonize national heroes and at the same time to honor the martyrs. Those two models are different, and we have to choose. And according to the witness of Paul, he's clear that his model is the martyr and not the national hero. With regard to Dimitris Tramatopoulos, thank you very much for your very fruitful observations. Indeed, I didn't have the time to explain how I understand the consciousness of the Gentiles, because it is obvious that the nation in the ancient times is not the same with the modern nation. That's very clear. But the Jews, Judaism, it has a very cohesive national consciousness in antiquity, with all these characteristics that I mentioned by Hutchinson and Smith, that is origin, myth of origin, common religion, and so on and so forth. So all these common characteristics are shared by the Jews, and they constitute a cohesive island in a world of loose national consciousness within the Roman world. But of course, if we go outside the borders of Rome, we can find again cohesive national consciousness. But within Rome, because it is a multinational empire, the cohesive national consciousness of the various people loosens up, and the consciousness of the Roman citizen comes to the fore, which is a supranational consciousness. So when we have a clash between the Jewish national consciousness and the loose national consciousness of the Gentiles, then we don't have a clash between two national consciousness, but a clash between one national consciousness and a civic social consciousness, which has some national dimension. So that's how I would describe it methodologically, but we could discuss that much further. Now, with regard to ecumenicity, this is a very broad discussion, as Mr. Meyendorff said. It's different if we say the Corinth church and the church in Corinth, because Paul regards the totality of the church inside locality. Paul has not yet conceived the concept of universality, because there is the proximate presence, because he expects during his own lifetime for presence to come. So he cannot have these ambitious visions that come later with the delay of divine presence. But he tries to proclaim to the world the gospel in very urgent procedures, because precisely the second coming is close, the presence is coming, and that's why he sees the totality of the church, but he stresses the locality of the church. And for Mr. Makrakis, I don't have I'm not a specialist on that, but if I haven't studied that issue very much. But for Paul, the reborn man is the man after the baptism. So in terms of Paul's theology, you cannot be reborn if you have been reborn through the baptism, and you have become the new man in Christ, the new creation. This comes once and forever. Rebirth is not something that continues. Thank you, Mr. Karakolis. You were very brief too, and we can discuss the rest during the coffee break. Thank you very much for this very interesting session. Very short, brief announcement. Our conference is being transmitted live through digital television throughout the world in both Greek and English. And there are some statistical data from intv. In the beginning of the morning session, there were 6,500 strikes for hits from 49 countries: Greece, Australia, USA, Belgium, Cyprus, Taiwan, Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, Serbia, Turkey, UK, Russia, Switzerland, Sweden, Bulgaria, Canada, Israel, Iceland, Argentina, Norway, South Africa, Ukraine, Romania, Albania, Finland, Japan, Armenia, Brazil, Ireland, China, Uganda, Korea, Moldova, Lithuania, Egypt, Czech Republic, Estonia, India, Syria, Slovakia, Spain, Thailand. Thanks to all of you. And we will have a 20-minute break now, just to